You're listening to KYRS, Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 on your FM dial. And coming to you now from a secure, well-disclosed location in downtown Spokane. I wanted to say it's Eat the Press, but it's not. It's Long Waves. And thank you for joining me on this beautiful Wednesday afternoon. It still doesn't feel like fall, much less winter, but such is how the world turns these days. Anyway, today's show is The Great Unraveling, and it seems that everywhere we look, we see all kinds of unraveling, whether we're talking about the racial divisions in Ferguson and throughout this country, the regional divisions that we see in Texas and the Deep South, Mississippi and Alabama and such places, the divisions based on wealth, divisions based on whether one is connected with power or is outside of it. And it seems that a lot of the what some people would call the social glue that held the country together, apparently, for a number of years is coming apart, which raises a lot of interesting questions. One of which is, was there ever a coherent nation in the United States? Now, I know people like Pat Buchanan are very, very fond of saying that they long for a return to the good old days when we all listened to the same music and watched the same movies, read the same books, sang the same songs. And it's obvious that such a world could only exist in Pat Buchanan's fevered memory, because the simple truth of the matter is we've never been a homogeneous people. We've never been a people with a unified set of beliefs and values. Although all of us have been largely sold this idea forever and ever and ever. It's part of the national mythos of the United States. Now, there's some people who just clearly don't buy it, people who in their daily lives are beaten down, are disenfranchised, are arrested, are murdered, are disempowered, are humiliated in a variety of ways. And this is just, in our country, in the United States, not the rest of the world, where the United States also performs these kinds of activities on people, a free gift without charge. There never was this period where we all were this great homogeneous whole. So leaving that aside for a minute, was there ever an idea that held the country together? I mean, there was this notion that somehow democracy, the idea that each individual person would vote, had some staying power, and that these votes could influence the outcome of national issues. So we could vote to, say, stop global warming. We could vote to stop wars. Well, it's a cute fantasy, and it's a great bedtime story for the children, but it's not true now, and in fact, it's never been true. And the technologies, the powers, the skills that exist to make sure that people still believe the myth to the extent that they can and continue to practice it, these skills are well developed. They're deployed constantly. And even so, the reality that voting really doesn't change anything, that whoever you vote for, in all likelihood, you're going to be betrayed. Whatever cause you try to advance through institutional structures simply won't advance. It'll get shut down. You can look at the Occupy Wall Street movement, a whole variety of different attempts to engage democratic processes that simply don't work. And since Citizens United, since the United States became openly available to the highest bidder, not just covertly available to the highest bidder, which has always been the case, but now it's out in the open, it's really hard to believe in democracy. But this leaves another question unanswered. What then is power? What is the driving force? If it's not the democratic institutions, if it's not law, if it's not the normative government, then where is power and what is power? We like to think power is invested in the institutions of the state, the Congress, the presidency, the courts. And yes, it is, but are these actually independent organizations, or are they run by other forces as well? Now, our first thought would be, oh, well, you're talking about wealth. It's wealth that owns the government. It's wealth that controls what happens in the world. And that's part of the answer. It is partly about wealth. But wealth is only one piece of a much larger puzzle, a much larger entity of interlocking structures, powers, organizations, and people who actually run the country, who actually use the country for their own purposes. Now, we can look and we can see the military, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, all of these people, the various police forces in the U.S., both federal, state, and local. Well, that's more than both, isn't it? Federal, state, and local, who increasingly are becoming more and more armed, more and more trained toward military kinds of tactics. We've seen the rate of SWAT raids in the country explode into the tens of thousands per year. Flashbangs, kicking in doors over what used to be routine issues, serving a search warrant, serving an arrest warrant, simple matters that cops used to just knock on the door for. But now it's kick in the door, throw in some flashbangs, and if anyone acts funny, just shoot on sight. And of course, there's no answerability for this. But this isn't really power. This is just the apparatus of control, the mechanism by which control is exerted. And in this case, it has two fundamental components to it. One is the use of raw, violent force with sufficient frequency that people know it exists, they know it's used rather more often, and so they're aware of it and they are afraid of it, because fear is an important mechanism of control, probably the greatest mechanism of control. So you can get people to fear the police, to fear going to prison, to fear the legal system. It's another way of keeping them ostensibly docile, keeping them under control, so they don't do things that power doesn't want them to do. But who is running the military? Who's running the police? Who is pulling the strings of the puppets of these apparatuses of control? Right? It's not just government, but indeed there are hidden layers of power that we don't see because we're using frameworks of thought and belief and analysis that simply don't fit the world as it exists. Now, part of this is a failure of media. Media failed? Oh my God. Stop the presses. Part of this is a failure of media, which simply don't report about the events in the real world in a way that gives us a coherent, cogent, consistent sense of how the world actually operates. Part of it's a failure of ourselves, our reticence to engage in reading, studying, understanding the world. And some of this is deliberate. There are a lot, as I've said before on the show, there are lots of distractions. But we end up with this fairy tale picture of the world, or fairy tale fragments of a picture of the world that's probably more accurate, little pieces of pictures of the world that simply don't fit into any kind of cogent explanation of the real world. So if we see, why are we in the Middle East? Why is the United States sending more troops, more planes, blowing up more people all over the Middle East? Well, we've got to stop terror. But everybody knows, who studies this problem, that this does not stop terror. It creates terror. This does not make places more safe and stable. It makes them less safe and stable. The issue has never been about establishing democracies or eliminating tyrants. It has always been about establishing safe havens for American industries, British industries, French industries, corporations, oil, bank, manufacturing, whatever, to move into countries like Iraq and extract the wealth of the countries. That's always been the game. Always been the game. It's just old B-flat imperialism, nothing fancy about it. But this is not a story we tell ourselves. It's about democracy or stopping terror, and the world's just full of these crazy people who, for completely inexplicable reasons, want to kill us, or blow us up, or at least chase us out of their countries. Go figure. Yet, as I've demonstrated on the show before, and we'll talk about in greater depth in the future, the U.S. is famous for knocking over democratically elected, democratically established, democratically running governments throughout the world simply because it wants their wealth. And then we consistently install tin-pot dictators who repress their people. The mystery isn't that so many people hate us around the globe. The mystery is why more people don't. Why the people in Venezuela don't hate us. Why the people in Chile don't hate the United States. That's a much more interesting question. But get back to the topic here. We are disconnected from events as they appear. And it looks like there are folks behind the scenes pulling the levers, pulling the levers, speaking into the microphone. And it's like the Wizard of Oz, ignore the man behind the curtain. And to a large extent, this is true. So what is the effect of this on our minds? What's the effect of this on our understanding of the world? What is the disconnect that this gives us with the world on a personal basis? What is the disconnect it gives us on the basis of our relationships one to another? We're told everything's okay. It's not. We know that. We know that politics in this country has failed. We know that economics in this country is a rigged game. We now find ourselves in a new Cold War. We find ourselves in more hot wars that will go on forever and ever and ever. They're not even defined to have an ending. We're not defeating this group or that group. We're fighting a strategy, a tactic. We're fighting terror. This will go on forever. We're playing Russian roulette with real Russians. You can only imagine how that's going to play out. So things aren't okay. And being aware of the disconnect with the world, people quite naturally sort of thrash around and look for connections, look for things that might make sense. How do I make sense out of the world? Well, sometimes this looks pretty crazy. We've got the Tea Party types who wear funny hats. We've got fundamentalisms of all kind, Christian identity movements, sovereign citizens, people like that. And I'll say more about them in a bit. And it's fairly easy to understand where these people are coming from. They know the real world is false. They get that. What they don't know is in what way it is false. That's the bit they miss. Because they think that if somehow the system were just tweaked a little bit, or this evil baby-killing Muslim black person in the presidency were removed, that we'd all go back to this mythic past that Pat Buchanan and others so long for. Well, that's nonsense. What people are largely doing is creating an imaginary real world. either built on nostalgia and a dimly remembered past growing up in homogeneous racial communities, or imagining a metaphysical world, whether they're going back to Jesus, and they have all kinds of interesting ideas. You know, you can't go on to the online news without finding somebody telling us how Jesus would want the poor to starve to death, or Jesus loves the rich, or some kind of nonsense like that. And sometimes, you know, we know this is completely disingenuous, but other times it seems to us, well, gosh, you know, maybe they really believe this nonsense. Maybe they really do. Who knows? Anyway, so they go back to figures who are almost as historic, almost as important in this country as Jesus. And let's not forget that Jesus wrote the Constitution. Anyway, they go back to Thomas Jefferson, who is a complex character, historically, extremely difficult to pin down on a lot of issues. But they rewrite Jefferson to their own advantage. And they rewrite Madison to their own advantage, and Washington, and everybody else. In exactly the same way, they will dive into the Bible, find some bizarre passage in the Old Testament that fits their current beliefs or their feeling at the moment, and decide that this is the inspired word of God that's going to guide them, and so they'll become a priest of the Phineas movement or some such nonsense. Anyway, these usually aren't very well thought out. It's almost like alchemy, where if you get the precise method, just the right method, and mix just the right ingredients together, and say the right words over it in a magic way, then lead's transformed into gold. All right, so the belief that somehow if you can only resurrect the true meaning of Madison and the Federalist Papers, or the true meaning of Thomas Jefferson, or the real literal meaning of Jesus, that somehow they'll turn the lead that is this country into the glittering city of gold set on a hill that Reagan promised us, paraphrasing, of course, the New Testament. The sovereign citizen people. They run around digging into Black's Law Library from 150 years ago, Black's Law Dictionary, and have this strange idea that if they get the correct combination of outdated legal ideas and formulations, then the government has no power because, look, I've got the right words here. So I'm a corporation. I'm a sovereign citizen. You can't tax me. You can't make me have driver's licenses. Blah, blah, blah. You have no power because I have these magic words which even I don't understand. Nonsense. We get that. But they are right about the falseness of the world. They are right about the injustice, the lies. They just don't understand what it is. And this is not just true of the right. This is true of I think, a lot of people in this country. We're so alienated from language. We're so alienated from understanding. We're so alienated from philosophy. We're so alienated from the importance of metaphor and language that we don't see the symbols of absolute power around us all the time. We don't see the rockets that we launch into space. We don't see the massive hotels that shoot up in our cities and in our neighborhoods as symbols of power as much as the pyramids. We look at the giantism that goes on in our major cities, and the World Trade Center was a classic example. Is massive, staggered high buildings. Monuments to what? To power? To wealth? And wherever we go in the world, whether we go to Dubai or Kuala Lumpur, everybody's, or Singapore or Shanghai, everybody's struggling, everybody's racing to build the bigger, better building. And this is a component of our culture, our system of existence, which I'll get into in a little more in just a second. of bigger, better, faster, farther, shinier, somehow better. Well, where did these values come from? And why do we hold them up as if they're somehow what we should be all about, what we should be concerned about, what we should be living with? And where would we even start to think about these things? Well, it used to be in this country, not that terribly long ago, that we had people who wrote books. Now, I know some of you are familiar with books. You've probably seen them, may even have a few rattling around the house. But back before the internet, books were where ideas lived. People read books to converse with the minds of others. Not the passing whimsies, not the drunken text, carefully thought out, linear, researched, crafted, well-written ideas. And one of these people was a man named Lewis Mumford. Mumford was, we don't have a word for him in English, but in Spanish he would be called a pensador, a thinker, a philosopher of culture. He wrote more books than I can count on a variety of topics of literature, on architecture. He was one of the chief architects for the Green Movement. He worked in New York City. He taught variously, and he wrote and wrote and wrote, and he did lots of very good research. It wasn't just that he pulled stuff out of the air, or he spun it out of whole cloth. He did very good historical research, and so when you read his books, you get these lengthy conversations, not just with history, but with other writers and other thinkers. And this is important. And one of his books, which was originally released in 1964 and was elaborated and re-released in 1970, was called The Myth of the Machine. It was 2 volumes. And in the second one, The Pentagon of Power, he accurately depicts and explains and traces the historical development of this implosion of human societies, of human cultures, globally. In the social, the political, the spiritual, the physical dimensions, he digs in and he looks at the interlocking activities, values, practices that produced the world that we inhabit. A world in which, as he wrote, we've lost sight of our historical task, which is now more imperative than ever, the task of becoming human. And indeed, we are arguably less human than we could be. We are arguably less human than we've been at times in our past. We're more isolated, we're more greedy, we're more selfish. Indeed, we are less human in a lot of important ways. Well, Mumford proposed the idea of these various technologies, various human activities that link together: power, profit, property, production. And these things come together in what he called the mega machine. So the mega machine is a kind of locking together of various technologies of power and control and production. Part of it has to do with what we would understand as technologies, but part of this is driven by things that he would call techniques, but things like banking, which is not technology as we understand it, but it fits in with this process of rationalisms and bureaucratic frameworks and social processes and plans which no rational person would support if they thought through it. But they're driven by the bureaucracy itself. They're driven by a peculiar kind of perverse rationality. And people do try to resist these sometimes, but they're generally ineffectual because they're working on the problem, on the wrong issue, you know. The left turns to organizing and demonstrations and votes. Let's go out and have a protest and show our solidarity with the oppressed people of wherever. Who cares? As if these worked. Right? Before the U.S. went into the Iraq War, there were multi-million person marches around the world. And that stopped it, didn't it? We can go out and show our solidarity with these people or those people, and that'll change what? Buckley's. Nada. Nothing. Al Haig, who was a very strange man from back in Reagan's administration, former commander of NATO, if I remember correctly, once remarked, let them protest as much as they want, as long as they pay their taxes. Because protest makes people feel good. Protest makes people feel powerful. And the powerful know that, and so they let it occur. They let it siphon off some of the discontent. Oh, I did my bit. I went and marched here. I signed that. I pushed a button on my computer and I signed that petition going to this congressperson or that person in government. And so I have done my bit. And golly gosh, things will be better now. Yeah, well, no. And as I said, the right turns to its own form of nostalgia and, various kinds of localisms, the good old days, but especially to this notion of our people. And this is significant because they're returning to the etymological origin of the idea of nation, which is a race, natio. It comes from the Latin word natio, which means nation or race or birth, to be born. Right? So that you were born among these people, that you are of their blood, that you are part of their world, gives you membership in this world. So you end up with a sort of semi-stable community based around a common language and living in more or less the same place and acting more or less the same because they grow up with the same folklores and mores and these sorts of things. And, so I can understand why people would want to try and get back to this. But, this has never been America. We've never been a nation. We've always had it in the form of little localisms, neighborhoods, communities. And the idea was that somehow we're going to be a grand melting pot and we would have everybody here and we'd all be able to share and understand each other and, operate around some democratic values. But when the system itself stops playing it fairly, all bets are off, right? And there's another problem with this return to ethnicities, the return to the birth group. And that is that ethnicity as identity plays into totalitarianism, because totalitarianisms are always founded on ethnic nationalism, whether it was the Serbs, whether it was the Hutus, whether it was the Nazis, whether it's the Ku Klux Klan. Totalitarianism is always founded on an ethnic nationalism and usually around a cult of the individual. So none of the forms of resistance actually make sense. People are really not understanding what it is they're dealing with. So let's look at how this mega machine pulls us inside, how it makes us play, and what it demands of us for doing that. And I would just remind any listeners who might have joined us since the beginning that you're listening to Long Waves on KYRS. I'm Gary Krug, your host for the show. So diving into Mumford, we are all bribed into participating in the modern mega machine, the Pentagon of Power. It gives us everything if we only surrender to it. Mumford writes this: provided the consumer agrees to accept what Megatechnics offers in quantities favorable to the continual expansion of the whole power system, he will be granted all the perquisites, privileges, seductions, and pleasures of the affluent society. If he only demands no goods or services except those that can be organized or manufactured by megatechniques, he will without doubt enjoy a higher standard of material culture, at least of a certain specialized kind, than any other society has ever achieved before. If anything, the luxuries will be more plentiful than the comforts. Though many basic human necessities do not lend themselves to megatechnics, will in fact be starved out of existence. In Fun City, one is not supposed to notice their absence. So, we get bribed into participating in the system that is going to buy us with materialism, with goods, with TVs, with little gadgets, with food, and these are all great things. These are all wonderful things. Except that they cost too much. Those already conditioned, quoting Mumford again, those already conditioned from infancy by school training and television tutelage to regard megatechnics as the highest point in man's conquest of nature will accept this totalitarian control of their own development not as a horrid sacrifice, but as a highly desirable fulfillment. Looking forward to being constantly attached to the big brain, we could call that the internet, as they are now attached to radio antennas by portable transistor sets, even while walking the streets. All right, this is 50 years ago he's writing this. 50 years ago he's talking about people getting tied into the big brain with their little portable radios. But now we've got our little Androids and iPhones, and so many of his prophecies have come frighteningly true. Well, just to continue, by accepting these means, they expect that every human problem will be solved for them, and that the only human sin will be that of failing to obey instructions. Their real life will be confined within the frame of a television screen. This was a man who was predicting 50 and 60 years ago precisely the kind of absolute totalitarian surveillance that we have learned is in fact the world we inhabit. I mean, if you can imagine such a thing, that is, he nailed it. He absolutely identified all of the key characteristics. Just a cite here. Theoretically, at the present moment, and actually soon in the future, God, that is the computer, will be able to find, to locate, and to address instantly by voice or image, via the priesthood, any individual on the planet, exercising control over every detail of the subject's daily life by commanding a dossier which would include his parentage and birth, complete educational record, an account of his illnesses and his mental breakdowns, if treated, his marriage, his sperm bank account, his income, loans, security payments, taxes, and pensions, and finally the dispositions of such further organs as may be surgically extracted from him just prior to the moment of his death. In the end, no action, no conversation, and possibly in time no dream or thought would escape the wakeful and relentless eye of this deity. And he's using that metaphor of the eye in a key way, because he's drawing it back to the Egyptian sun god, Re. And he notes that the eye of Re had a kind of independent existence, and was involved in creating and directing all of the cosmic activities and all of the human activities. And so people are, in a sense, recreating this. And hence he talks about the priesthood, those who serve power, those who serve the surveillance machine. Quoting him again here, if anything could testify to the magical powers of the priesthood of science and their technical acolytes, and declare unto mankind the supreme qualifications for absolute ruleship held by the divine computer, this new invention alone should suffice. So the final purpose of life in terms of the mega machine at last becomes clear. It is to furnish and process an endless quantity of data in order to expand the role and ensure the domination of the power system. Well, that sounds a lot like where we are now, doesn't it? A lot like where we are. So if you think about inhabiting a system that manufactures everything, that demands all power be incorporated into it and doled out through various bureaucratic administrations. I'm starting to sound like Hayek here. Sorry, Brooks. If we look at a system where these false rationalities, the progeny of what John Saul called Voltaire's bastards, look at the kind of world it creates. We see it affecting all aspects of life. It affects our perception of the world. It affects our perception of the other, and it affects our perception of the self. It turns the world into a resource. So the world doesn't exist for itself. It exists as it can be used. And if you live in Spokane, you see these miles and miles of trains rolling through the city every day, hauling the mountaintops of West Virginia to ships going to China, hauling the oil from the Spokane fields and from British Columbia in tank cars, going to refineries. Because the world exists as a resource to be used. It has no intrinsic value, no worth, no being in itself. So our perception of the world is modified in that way, even down to the level of people. People become resources, or they have no value, and you can simply dispose of them. Now, if we think about our perception of the other, this sort of thinking reduces us to simplistic similarities and differences: skin color, language, ethnicity. We lose diversity and we lose difference. We lose subtlety, we lose nuance, and we fall into the trap that somehow these distinctions are in fact meaningful. They're not as distinctions, as parts of a whole. They are meaningful. And if we look at the perception of the self, of ourselves, and how that's transformed in these rationalist systems, above all, we lose agency. We lose our ability to act in meaningful ways. Nothing we do makes any difference. We can't really affect anything. We can't change anything. We can't even quit. What does this give us? It gives us identity crises. Who are we? It gives us depression. It gives us anxiety, locked into a system that we know at any moment could be pulled out from under us, leaving us destitute, or even worse, imprisoned. Creates fear and uncertainty and makes us even more pliable. This loss of agency leads to totemic thinking. So we have lots of little magical totems that we hold on to because we think they're going to make us better. They're going to make us safer. Guns. Guns, lots of guns. Can't have too many guns, and basements full of ammunition. And I'm amazed to this day how many people think that the federal government is buying up all the ammunition. It's not. It's the gun nuts buying all the ammunition because they think when the world ends, they're going to use it for money. So there you go, guys. It's just hoarding. Literal religion with these anthropomorphic deities serve pretty much the same function. You can imagine deities that fit your need in the world, and so they become worth having. But they really don't fit the understandings of the needs of the present. It is that opium that Marx talked about. So, conditioned from childhood to be in the mega machine, we give up our humanity to the terror of materialism. And this has another interesting effect, too. Mumford notes that without waiting for the millennial day, when enough is produced for everyone, without waiting for that millennial day, an increasing number of moral dropouts, responding to advertisers' frantic incitements to instant affluence have begun to help themselves to whatever goods they can lay their hands on. Shoplifting, theft, looting, burglary, crimes once committed only by antisocial types or by the desperate poor, have become a growing practice among people who are poor and deprived in the peculiar sense that they will never be able to possess, either by purchase or free gift, all the goods that the affluent society insists are essential to their happiness. Only theft will satisfy their insatiable needs. And Mumford goes on to note that these are machine addicts. They're addicted to the machine system that's structuring our lives and our thoughts and our desires. These machine addicts, he writes, are ready to give up their prerogatives as human beings, the right to be alive, to exercise all their organs without officious interference, to see through their own eyes, hear with their own ears, to work with their own hands, to move on their own legs, to think with their own minds, to experience erotic gratification, and to beget children in their direct sexual intercourse. In short, reacting as whole human beings to other whole human beings in constant engagement with both the visible environment and the immense heritage of historic culture, whereof technology is only a part. So that's what we give up. That's what fails. Being human. We lose the ability to be human. That's the cost of, one of the costs of participating in the mega machine and the megatechnic society that Mumford described well over 50 years ago. There is another condition, though, that the mega machine demands of us, and that's the organization man, as he calls it, the organizational thought, the bureaucrat, the technocrat, the man in the gray flannel suit. And we know the people, the guys that sit in offices and control the world, those folks. But let's just see what Mumford had to say about them. The characteristic virtues of organization man correspond as nearly as possible to the machine he serves. Thus, the part of his personality that was projected in mechanical instruments in turn reinforces that projection by eliminating any non-conforming organic or human qualities. The stamp of mechanical regularity lies on the face of every human unit. To follow the program, to obey instructions, to pass the buck, to be uninvolved as a person in the needs of other persons, to limit responses to what lies immediately, so to say, on the desk, to heed no relevant human considerations, however vital, never to question the origin of an order or to inquire as to its ultimate destination, to follow through every command, however irrational, to make no judgments of value or relevance about the work in hand. Finally, to eliminate feelings or emotions or rational moral misgivings that might interfere with the immediate dispatch of work. These are the standard duties of the bureaucrat. And these are the conditions under which the organization man flourishes. A virtual automaton within a collective system of automation. All right, well, we all know what that's about. The cubicle people doing their mindless jobs, shuffling their paper, not dealing with any of the consequences of what's going on. But we often miss the terrible end point of that existence. The terrible end point of that existence. If we think about Adolf Eichmann, the exterminator that Hitler used against the Jews, recall that the observation that Hannah Arendt made at his trial in Jerusalem and published in the New Yorker magazine, which no one wanted to hear, that Eichmann was not an evil man. He was a bureaucrat. He was a person without morals. He was a person without moral judgment. He was a person who really wasn't concerned with the feelings of others. He had his job in front of him. And Mumford writes, continuing here, unfortunately, our time has produced many such heroes who have been willing to do at a safe distance with napalm and atom bombs, and I could add with drones, by a mere press of the release button, what the exterminators at Belsen and Auschwitz did by old-fashioned handicraft methods. The latter were slower in production, but far more thrifty in carefully preserving the byproducts, the human wastes, the gold from the teeth, the fat, the bone meal for fertilizer, even the skin for lampshades. In every country, there are now countless Eichmanns in administrative offices, in business corporations, in universities, in laboratories, in the armed forces, orderly, obedient people, ready to carry out any officially sanctioned fantasy, however dehumanized and debased. How else do you fly drones? How else do you blow up children? How else do you murder total strangers? How else do you despoil a planet? They don't get up one day and say, I feel like destroying mountains and really ruining people's entire communities. No. They get up, they look at how much coal they need, they look at what it'll cost to get it from here and ship it to there, and they do the job. They tick the box, and there's no moral component to it. That is the structure of our world. That's the structure of our economy. It's the structure of our military, of our politics, of our thought, of our education, of our advertising, of our lifestyles, so-called. It is this, to be little Eichmanns, who aren't evil people. And gee, I'm sorry that, the coal that was dug out of your mountain removed the whole top of it and poisoned your water, and your community's now dying, and your children are suffering horrible side effects from the chemicals that washed down. But gosh, it didn't mean to do any harm to you there. So it used to be that we could, in this country, could outsource a lot of this madness. We could just outsource the destruction, the slavery, the peonage of the working poor who would pick our fruit or mine the goods, or we could outsource these to other countries, or at least to Appalachia, which might as well be another country sometimes, and was certainly treated like that for much of its existence. But now it's all coming home. Now the U.S. is apparently the largest oil exporter in the world, largest oil producer in the world. And for those who said, drill, baby, drill, newsflash, we're actually shipping most of it overseas. And with the Transatlantic Partnership Trade Treaty and the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Treaty, that's likely where all of the oil is going to be going, or a very large percentage of it to Europe and to Japan and China. So in a very real sense, everything that we've done overseas is coming home. So if they're kicking in doors in Iraq, well, guess what? They're kicking in doors here. If Shia are killing Sunni at our instigation and with our guidance, then guess what? We're going to be killing people here. It always comes home. And we've got lots of our own little Eichmanns. And I do remember when the scholar at the, I'm trying to recall his name, at the Colorado University, Native American gentleman, Ward Churchill, posted an article right after 9/11 on chickens coming home to roost, meaning terrorism coming back to bite America that we'd been exporting for so long. And basically, he was hounded out of his job. But his point was well taken. His point is absolutely well taken, that the towers are full of little Eichmanns in exactly the sense that Arendt meant it, in exactly the sense that Mumford meant it. Not that they're evil people, that they're people without souls, without hearts, without care. In that sense. But of course, that's too hard to explain on TV. It's much easier to demonize him, and anyone who critiques the machine in a way that gets attention gets leaned on. Where Churchill got leaned on. If anybody listened to this show and took it seriously, I'd probably get leaned on. But that's one of the great things about doing community radio in a medium-sized town kind of in the middle of nowhere. I'm just not popping up on a lot of radars. Anyway, you know, there are some secrets that are necessary for totalitarianism to flourish. There truly are. But they're all hidden in plain sight. I mean, this is a weird bit. From the very beginning, right? From the very beginning, secrecy is imperative for power to function. Secrecy is the sine qua non of power. And if we look at what developed, from the military and industry and government, what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, who create this more and more enclosed, metaphorically speaking, enclosed citadel of power and thought and action. And they would reach out a tentacle now and then and put some suckers on academia and through grant money and pull academics into it or into industry and pull industry into it. And so they could make more weapons and more gadgets and more wars to destroy these things. Right? And it was interesting how this developed, because we had, I was saying we're in another Cold War. If we go back to the first Cold War, it was funny because the Russians and the Americans really kind of changed places. And Mumford has a great quote on this. I'll just read to you now. In the course of this development, the two dominant megamachines exchanged characteristics. The Russian machine departed from the obsolete original model by relying ever more heavily on its scientific and technological arm, while the American machine took over the most regressive features of the Tsarist Stalinist system, vastly augmenting both its military force and its agents of centralized control. Its agents of centralized control. The Atomic Energy Commission, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, all secret agencies whose methods and policies have never been openly discussed or effectively challenged, still less curtailed by the national legislative authority. So deeply entrenched are these agents that they dare to flout and disobey the authority of both the President and the Congress. That was 50 years ago. You think it's gotten any better? Look around. I pretty much tell you it hasn't. It's gotten much worse. And that he had the prescience to see this 50 years ago, to see it coming, to identify it so clearly. Right? All of the mechanisms for this totalitarianism, that this smiling, happy, inverted totalitarianism that we inhabit, are in plain sight, as are the mechanisms of social control. And these latter are far too well established and so taken for granted that very few people notice them. They're too much a part of ordinary everyday life. And if people do notice them, well, that's going to take a lot of moral courage to act, isn't it? Especially if you think you're acting alone. Especially if you think you're acting alone. You know, none of this should really surprise us. It's, as I say, it's been in plain sight. It just hasn't been taught in schools, and people haven't talked about it. Back in 1933, Major General of the United States Marine Corps, a gentleman named Smedley Butler, gave an address, which he later wrote up as a book called War is a Racket. And he was describing his life in the military. He said, only a small group inside knows what it is about. It's conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the masses. This isn't a trick in the there isn't a trick in the racketeering bag that the military gang is blind to. It has finger men to point out its enemies, its muscle men to destroy enemies, its brain men to plan war preparations, and a big boss supranationalistic capitalism. I suspected I was part of a racket at the time. Now I'm sure of it. Like all the members of the military profession, I never had a thought of my own until I left service. My mental facilities remained in suspended animation while I obeyed the orders of higher-ups. I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefits of Wall Street. The record of racketeering is long. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of the Brown Brothers in 1909 through 12. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. In China, I helped to see that it was Standard Oil that went on its way unmolested. During those years, I had, as the boys in the back room would say, a swell racket. Looking back on it, I feel I could have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. Thin edge of the wedge. But, again, where did that military system come from? Why was it doing what it was doing? And why were we okay with it? Because we were getting the payoff, and we could always say, we never knew it was going on. We didn't know about those camps. We were just minding our business, doing our jobs, following orders. Well, as we like to say, but never like to do, that's no defense. Anyway, that's the end of our show today. You've been listening to Long Waves with Gary Krug, and I'll be back next week, same time, with another station. You can write me at longwaves@kyrs.org. You can follow the show on Facebook and also write me there. That's Long Waves Radio on Facebook. And until next week, I'll be back. And I'll just say again, you've been listening to KYRS Medical Lake Spokane, 88.1, 92.3. And a good night to all.